believers, unaffiliated believers, sort of believers, and even you think I'm a believers? Welcome to the Uncensored Unprofessor, a podcast where we happily welcome converts, but where we think like disciples. Personally, I found my last conversation with him so informative that I invited him back for a second episode. Dr. Darren Guerra, professor of political science at Biola University in Southern California, is an expert on the Constitution. In 2015, he published his book, Perfecting the Constitution, The Case for the Article 5 Amendment Process. In today's show, he and I variously explore the founders' root principles, how the biblical view of human nature played into the founders' worldview, how the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution work together, how rivalries, tensions, and diverse interests are actually good for the functioning of the nation, and whether or not the Electoral College is fair. And me, because I'm intrigued, I also ask him about the federal government's handling of COVID. Is this being done in a constitutional manner? So sit back, relax, and think carefully with us about America's founding, the founders, and the principles to which they were committed. Last week we talked kind of directly, try to unpack the way the founders were wired and how they were Christian or whether they were Christian or what that meant in their day. How do we look back on that today? And Darren, I want to think with you more about the founding, not necessarily because I'm trying to establish some Christian apologetic and prove that they were soaring, beautifully attuned evangelicals, but because we can understand the truth. And as we were just saying together in private, I think that the education system has so failed us on these matters. I still remember in junior high, we had classes on the Constitution or sections of classes on the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and the founders, and we were even taught how to be a good citizen in light of what the way the founders structured America. And since we have that gap, that hole, that lacuna, I thought, you know what? I'd love to have Dr. Guerra on again and help us think more carefully about this kind of stuff.
No, you're so right, Ed. And you know, but my mom, we taught kindergarten, used to say it all the time, like education follows the fashions. Every few years, there's a new trend, a new fad that education kind of latches onto, and it's just not fashionable to do citizenship or to teach about the roots of our country. It's just out of fashion, you know. And I'm recalling back when I was an undergraduate student, the fashion of the day for academics, let alone K through 12, was to hold to the line that the founders were essentially deists, which is another saying they weren't very Christian. They didn't hold their faith very seriously. And the fashion of the day was it was a basically secular, if not atheistic founding with some vestiges of old Christianity. And I took that as well. That must be the way it is. If that's what the smart people are saying, as I've become more knowledge about these things and study these things, the best people, the best scholars are, I mean, there's still, debate here and there, but the best evidence is saying, no, this was a deeply Christian country in the way we talked last week. Their basic premises, the way they approached humanity, the way they approached all these things, they were seriously Christian throughout. So at least philosophically, culturally, it was a Christian founding, and deists were, there were some prominent ones, but even they were more Christian than people would want to admit. So it is an important topic.
Well, and you always wonder how much of that gets sifted out for ideological reasons that there may have, I mean, it may be ignorance, historical ignorance, that we thought they were all committed deists, but it may have been ideological too.
Right. Yes. Yeah, exactly.
And I'm still thinking with you about education. I think today being a good citizen would be the class would teach you to how to throw the wrapper from your condom in the trash.
Yeah. Sadly, I come from a family who's all in education. My brothers, my parents, and things have deteriorated quite a bit. that being said, there's a lot of good people who are in it, and they're kind of like you know, holding back the chaos as much as they can day to day in classrooms, and they're keeping their heads down and teaching truth as best they can. And I'm thankful for them because the system is definitely rigged against them, and it doesn't encourage teachers to teach essentially the truth anymore. And education is no longer about truth seeking; it's about um, ideological and political agendas, and that's increasingly the case, especially here in California. I have good friends who are just lamenting. They're like, "Oh, I don't know how much longer I can do this because I'm being asked to do and teach things that I don't believe, and they're not true. I can't lie for them, you know." So, anyways, it's
Yeah. Yeah, Paul in Thessalonians talks about that which restrains will be removed, and I'm thinking with you, those good people, Christian or not, who just want to teach the truth and
yes.
and teach integrity to students. They are kind of the restraining element in the school system.
And I think there are more of them than one thinks, because again, talking with friends who are in the system, they talk about people who aren't believers, but as you said, they want to teach the right thing, and we're attuned as humans to truth, and it takes a lot of ideology and a lot of bad influences to untune us towards truth. But there are still a lot of good people out there if we can make some headway at the top of the food chain. It will allow people to teach what needs to be taught and do it well.
Yeah, and I'm taking tremendous courage and hope from all these parents that are standing up
Yes.
and probably getting involved at the school district, at the school board level, like maybe never in our lives. So there's some positive to all of this.
Yeah, and that back to our topic of the day, that school board involvement, that level of democratic engagement is what the system was built around. So that's
Wonderful. So let's dig into that. When we think again about the founding, and I know the founders, we talked about reason and principles and drawing on the best of philosophy over the centuries. When the founders were setting about forming the government, when they began to think about the Constitution, what was their first concern? What was a root principle, or what were their core standards? There must have been commitments that they wanted to build out of, principles that they wanted to kind of have serve as their scaffolding.
yeah. Well, I mean, Abraham Lincoln, who obviously because of time he wasn't one of the original founders, but he was characterizing it well. He said the Declaration of Independence was an apple of gold, a word fitly spoken, and the Constitution and the Union were a picture of silver framed around it. And if that sounds familiar, it's from Proverbs 25:11, a word fitly spoken. And so just another example of where the founding generation and the generations after it were so immersed in biblical language and biblical literacy that they just used it. And so, but what was Lincoln talking about there? The Declaration of Independence is an apple of gold, a word fitly spoken. The Constitution is a frame of silver around it. Well, what do you frame? You frame the thing you want to highlight, you want to draw attention to. And so in Lincoln's case he's making there with this biblical reference is that the Constitution and the Union, they were in service of the principles of the Declaration. And so that's a fundamental thing to get right, is that the Constitution is in service of the Declaration. And so all the worldview stuff we were talking about last time, and that is in the Declaration, and it's carried through into the framing of the Constitution. But the Constitution is a legal document of sorts, and so it's not going to have the flowery language. It doesn't have as many references directly to God. And so you've had academics, again, another academic fad, where they've said, well, the Constitution is a secular document. Again, only in the sense that it doesn't directly reference God and it doesn't directly reference Scripture, but the whole worldview in which it was written was a Christian worldview. And it was there to be the picture of silver around the Declaration, which does reference God numerous times and
Yeah.
lays out basic fundamental Christian premises. So that's the first thing to get right, is they were writing the Constitution to highlight and to give voice to the principles of the Declaration. If you will, that the Declaration of Independence referenced the ideas, maybe the natural law ideas, and then the Constitution was the institutional expression. Like, how do these ideas become real? If you believe in rule of law, what does that look like? If you believe that human beings are reasonable creatures and capable of reason, what does that look like in institutional settings? If you believe human beings are equal morally, what does that look like in institutions? So I think it's at the outset, we need to realize that the Constitution is a institutional expression of the principles of the Declaration, which they are in turn, it's an expression of these this Western tradition, this Christian tradition that we were talking about last week.
That's fun, and I appreciate how Lincoln sets that up. The Declaration of the Independence is the gold image, and the Constitution is the silver frame around it. That's very clever. I read an article this morning by Martin Diamond, who was the professor of a mutual mentor, family member for me, Dennis McNutt. And Diamond's argument was similar. He was saying that the Declaration of Independence, the core commitment there was liberty, and where that liberty is derived and how it doesn't derive from the government. And then that the Constitution was erected 11 years later, 11 years after the writing of the Declaration. The Constitution was put in place to unpack liberty and to defend it, and to, in even some ways, to restrain it. So is the genius of the Constitution merely that it has this notion of governmental checks and balances, or how should we think about that?
Yeah, that's part of the genius. I think in academic circles, there gets a lot of debate about, again, what I was talking about, the secular Constitution versus the more lofty language of the Declaration. But I think Lincoln kind of links them. And then read this is from Federalist 51. A dependence on the people is no doubt the primary control on government, but experience has taught mankind the necessity of auxiliary precautions. This policy of supplying by opposite and rival interests the defect of better motives might be traced through the whole system of human affairs, private as well as public. What is he saying there? Separation of powers, checks and balances, interest controlling interests, which we spend a lot of time in politics and political science. It's ubiquitous, all the analyses of this system where interests are counteracting interests, and that's a wonderful system. But here, Madison is saying these are auxiliary precautions, right? They're extra. He says the dependence is on the people, right? And the people, we know from other references that you can find thousands of references from the founders saying you can't have government without a religious people. And so I just want to make that point, is that yes, the Constitution, the institutions, these structures, these checks and balances, they are very, very important. But even Madison references them as auxiliary precautions. If you don't have a moral people, a virtuous people, and you don't have a culture that promotes that generally, then these auxiliary precautions aren't going to work. They're not enough. You can't just have clashing interests and have a society that works. You need to have a virtuous people. And John Adams famously said, our Constitution was made only for a moral and a religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. So
yeah, well, I want to think with you later today about how we are, by having a secular, almost now celebratorily atheist culture, how that is jeopardizing the structure of our government. But I want to keep unpacking this with you. So they knew that morality and virtue, we talked about virtue last week, they knew that morality and virtue were like the seeds or the fertilizer, the energy that needed to be down inside all of those mutually all those competing interests, those checks and balances. It wasn't just a political structure that they thought would hold it all together.
Exactly, exactly. The political structure was there to be an auxiliary precaution against the failure of human um, of all the human failings, right? And but they still felt that the as he says in Federalist 51, the primary controlling government is the people, the virtuous people. And then we build these auxiliary precautions because we know humans aren't saints all the time. We're sinners and saints. We're capable of sainthood, but we're also capable of being sinners. And so they wanted to build a system that promoted the saint in us, but provided precautions against the sinner in us, if you want to put it that way. And so that's the part that often gets lost. I think some academics focus so much on the machinery, they forget about the need for the virtuous people. And sometimes you get other religious folks who's like, well, we need a virtuous people. They forget about the machinery. And it's like, you need both. And that was part of the genius of the founders, is they realized if we have a moral and virtuous people, that's great. That's the foundation, but it's not enough. We also need to construct and erect systems and institutions that build on that, but also control for the fallenness of human beings. And the founders knew that as well as anybody, because they were part of the English Commonwealth, and that had failed. It had deteriorated. And so they were trying to prevent a repeat of what they'd experienced under England. England had this celebrated government, but had been basically taken over, co-opted by parliamentary power. Parliament had become this single power within the system. And the English saw this as kind of this great modern development, but even Englishmen such as Burke and others were like, this is a problem. And the Americans were trying to avoid that. And so when they were constructing our system, they were constantly looking to history where other systems had failed. And so anyways, it's this team of virtue and this constitutional system.
No, and I think that is profoundly important. To me, one of the genius elements of Scripture, of the Bible, is its understanding of human nature. And I think this is lost again on contemporary Christians. God bless us, we're concerned with salvation and heaven, and I will never denigrate that. But sometimes we miss the genius elements of what's going on in a biblical worldview. And one of those is the fact that it recognized from the first chapter that we are fallen. Yes. And that we need to be built up in righteousness, or our moral frame needs to be trained and built up. The Lord gives the 10 Commandments. The Lord shows and reveals his righteousness to shape our souls. And today, what we have almost the flip opposite of that in education. I think the assumption is people are naturally good. Now we just need to train them to be gooder, right? But that notion that somehow deep in our hearts there's a seed of wickedness or evil or selfishness or pettiness is sort of lost. And the founders were ardently committed to that as they unpacked their whole system here. That worldview shows up in their system, doesn't it?
Yes. Oh, exactly. I mean, they were. I like to say that in terms of the view of human nature, the founders believed it was fixed and mixed. Fixed in the sense that folks like Rousseau, say the second wave of modernity, were saying, no, human nature is ultimately malleable. You can recreate man in our own image. Humans would say, and that's where you get out of that kind of Rousseau tradition and others. You get kind of Marxist adventures and let's just remake man. Let's make a Marxist man and let's remake human nature. The founder said, no, human nature is fixed. You're not going to change it. But then you had folks like Hobbes on the other side saying, yeah, human nature is fixed and it's a pretty bad thing. The state of nature is nasty, brutish, and short. And man is this evil thing that needs to be restrained. And so we need to construct the Leviathan to control him. And so you have on either side, you have Rousseau thinking everything's bunnies and ice cream, and you have Hobbes, everything's dark. And the founders positioned themselves in the biblical center, which is, no, human nature is fixed. Hobbes is right about that. But we are capable of great good. We're capable of reason. We are equal beings according to God. So Hobbes is wrong that we can't have this all-powerful Leviathan just pounding us whenever we get out of line. We are equal beings capable of reason. And so human nature is fixed and mixed. And so, yes, you're right. They believe that. And so they constructed our system on that premise, right? In Federalist 1, they said, this when we're constructing the Constitution, this is a question of whether societies of men are really capable of or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend on their political constitutions on accident and force. So most of human history, historical accidents like a king dying or a battle won or lost, and the stronger dictates the new form of government, and they control the form of government. That's constitutions of accident and force. And the founders saw, we have a great opportunity here. Can we establish good government from reflection and choice? Can we use our reason, our God-given reason, to construct a government that reflects the true equality of human nature? And so they had a sense that this was a historical opportunity, rare in human history, that they were going to do their best with, and they did the best that they could.
So they saw, again from Scripture, they were. We obviously see that repeated in the Declaration of Independence, that human beings are created imago Dei, that our rights stem from God. There's a dignity to being human that comes with creation, but that we are simultaneously, at the same time, we are also fallen.
Yes, yes. And so you can't get too optimistic. Build a system based on virtue, but has auxiliary precautions, as he said, to control for the, as he says, the defect of better motives, right? And this what Madison also says in Federalist 51. But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government, which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. So that you see them kind of wrestling with, humans are capable of good government, but they're also fallen, and we need to build in checks and balances, if you will. We need to separate powers to keep them from using their power to lord it over those who aren't in power at the moment.
So, and at least to my mind, that helps to account for why this has lasted for 245 years. That awareness of human nature, and how to both build from it and esteem it, and also to be wary of it and leery of it.
That's right. That's right.
So, Darren, and I'm no expert by any stretch, but you mentioned Madison a couple times in that little article I read this morning. Diamond rather postulated, and maybe it was too quickly, that Madisonian philosophy or Madisonian thinking sort of carried the day at the Constitution, perhaps even over against Jefferson and Adams. Is that too fast? I may be playing too fast with Diamond, but he said that along the way. I just wonder, as a expert, what your take would be on that.
I think that there's a good amount of truth to it. You can always, oversimplify things, but Madison had a keen intellect, and he had a mind that was, and he had trained himself to think very ably about institutional structures and how they would play out and how they wouldn't. And he provided key leadership in that area. Now, if you read the convention debates, Madison lost on some key votes. So his what he wanted or foresaw didn't always come to fruition. But to say that he was kind of the mastermind, and certainly in the Federalist Papers, his explanation of key principles and concepts, he's certainly the lead, he and Hamilton. So I don't think it's too much an overstatement to say the Madisonian mind of sorts kind of took the lead. Jefferson wasn't even at the convention. But there were other great influences, James Wilson, Roger Sherman, a number of other people who contributed, but certainly Madison took the lead for sure.
Interesting. So then, looking at the Constitution as a document, what would you say is your favorite thing about it? What do you most admire about what they did there? How do you assess that?
Well, I mean, I believe it's the institutional expression of what we were just talking about. Is that they said, okay, we can't allow one institution to dominate, right? And so we are going to separate powers. This common phrase that we're all familiar with as school kids: separation of powers. But what does that mean? Okay, we're going to have the executive power embodied in the presidency, the judicial power in the courts, and the legislative power invested in Congress. Now, the founders believed that Congress, what had happened in human history and what they had experienced with Parliament, is the legislative branch often comes to dominate. Right now, today we'd be like, where is what do they do? But anyway, they were experiencing, and in the states, a lot of the state legislatures had become tyrannical, and I could give you examples of that where they would just put people in jail if they didn't like so. For one quick example is there were paper money laws, and they would print paper money, which we all know now causes rampant inflation. And people who are trying to pay off their debts with paper money, the person didn't want to accept the paper money, right? Because the legislature had been taken over by the farming interests, and they wanted to pay off their debts cheaply with this paper money. The merchants wouldn't accept it. So what did the legislature do? They said, well, if you don't accept the paper money, within 3 days, you will be put in jail. Right? Can you imagine that today? Like, and so examples of this, and we'd say that's tyrannical. It was, and this was going on in the colonies after the revolution. And they said, oh, this is a problem. So things like that led to the separation of powers. We need to have a robust legislature because that's the voice of the people, but the legislature can't run amok either. So we need to have a robust executive in the president. We need to have a robust judiciary in the courts. And so this separation of powers is really at the heart of our system. And so when we talk about debates today where Congress or the president or the courts are overstepping their bounds, those are important conversations to have because that's at the heart of our system. If you allow the president or the Congress or the courts to predominate and take over the system, then you're really destroying the system we have that's built on this balance.
So that's fascinating. They'd seen some of the bad developments in the colonies, and it just makes me think again as a neophyte, someone who isn't particularly studied in this field. They had 11 years there, and it may be that 11 years between the Declaration and the Constitution was a blessing because they got to see how things were already beginning to spin or digress in certain places.
Yes, and it had become a crisis, and that's what precipitated the Constitutional Convention. Is things were not going well. There was, debtor revolts. There was oppressive legislatures. There was all sorts of problems. They said we need to get a handle on this, and so that 11 years was crucial, but also just in the larger framework, the colonies had pretty much governed themselves for well over 100 years. So that's what partially led to the revolution. That is what led to the revolution. But yes, but your point is well taken. They had a lot of experience, and they drew on that experience when they had a chance to construct this government of reflection and choice.
Fascinating, cool stuff. I'm always appreciative of people who learn from experience, since wisdom is so diminished, and old people today are so put off. They're so ignored when for all of human history people would go to old people because they'd learned things through experience. Oh man.
Well, go ahead.
No, so as we think through all of this and the separation of powers and the genius of the founding and their awareness of human nature, as we move toward our own era, how are we moving away from what they desired? What do you see as the kind of worst or perhaps the most dangerous developments that are going on today? We always hear people screaming on both sides, and I think for good reason, about executive orders or most everybody? No. Some people, well, a few people are concerned about it, a national debt that is going to crush us. What kinds of things are moving away from the ideals the founders had ensconced there in those founding documents?
Well, I'd say fundamentally, what you see the overall tendency is this move away from deliberative democracy. Um, and what the founders did well is they're moving away from a parliament that had gotten way too powerful, right? It pretty much was no one could challenge parliament, not the king. There was nobody. Parliament was predominant, and it was basically democracy on speed, if you will, and the Americans were falling victim to it. Well, since the late 1800s, the progressive movement in the United States has Woodrow Wilson and others fell in love with the simplicity of the parliamentary system. And even here today, I've had numerous discussions with political scientists saying, oh, the parliamentary system is so much cleaner and so much nicer and so much more efficient, right? And what that is it's a love of efficiency over reasoned deliberation, right? They like it because it's clean, because a parliamentary system, the parliament or the legislature can pretty much do whatever it wants with very little checks on this power, other than the people voting in a different parliament. That's what you watch in England. You know, they'll change governments and stuff. And most of Europe and a lot of the world has these parliamentary systems. Well, these are systems devoted wholly to, I would say, democratic tyranny. Essentially, it's the majority is unstoppable. There's very little, if nothing, restraining the majority. And our system keeps inching more and more towards kind of democratic tyranny. Wilson, the progressive movement from the early part of the century and the 30s onward have always railed against our constitutional separation of powers, the checks and balances. And, you know, you see from time to time Republicans who are kind of ignorant of our system saying, well, we need more executive power, and we need the courts to do this or that. We need to respect the system, which built in opportunities for reasoned deliberation, right? Congress is supposed to reason together. It has a Senate and a House so that they can balance each other off and they can each reason in different capacities, right? The House has 2-year terms. The Senate has 6-year terms. That incentivizes, we know that selfish people will be in these positions and they want to get reelected. And so these staggered terms ensure that they will have time to reason at different ways and in different capacities and different forums. And I'll often say to my students, I'll just use a ridiculous example. Let's say someone wants pink money, right? They're envious of all the colored money that the rest of the world has, and our money is green and boring. They want pink money, and they want to get it through. Well, the way our system is built, they won't get their immediate wish, right? The people who want pink money won't get their wish unless they capture the House. That'll take 2 years. And then they capture the presidency. That'll take 4 years because the president needs to sign off on the bill. And unless they capture the Senate, which could take as much as 6 years, right? So our system is democratic. The people will get what they want, but they won't get it right away, right? If people think it's a bad idea, it will take them 6 years to vote in individuals who agree with their pink money scheme, if that's the example we're using, right? So our system is fundamentally democratic, but is built in these deliberative moments, these deliberative capacities in our legislators and our president. And then if you know the pink money is unconstitutional somehow, I don't think it would be, the courts can weigh in, right? So deliberation, but everything in our day is moving against deliberation. We want it now, we know what we want it immediately, and we want to tear down any kind of barriers, whether it's enhancing executive power, whether it's moving to getting rid of the filibuster in the Senate, whether it's expanding the Supreme Court. It's all this kind of fad of what Herbert Storing used to call simplistic democracy. And if you remember back to our conversation last time, democracy was often viewed as tyranny, and it often was tyrannical in the ancient medieval world and so forth. And so democracy was often a bad word, but in America it became a good word because we were able to restrain it. We were able to give people the power that they deserve, the moral equality, but do so in a way that was sober, that was moderate, that made.
Yeah, that's so good. So, see, I'm someone who loves efficiency, and I'm sure that probably the whole nation is that way. I love things that are efficient. I love that I don't even have to get out of my car to wash my windshield now. I can just hit the button, turn the wipers on, and my windshield's getting a quick, immediate cleaning. So it's counterintuitive to a modern 21st century sensibility that the founder said, you know what? We want this to work slow. We want stuff to change slowly. We don't want this to be that the king says off with their heads and then tomorrow they're off with their heads, or that the DOJ says we don't like parents at school board meetings protesting, so we're going to chill them with threat of with lawsuit or arrest. The founders wanted things to move slow. They wanted that sober reflection. They wanted that sense of being deliberate and thoughtful. And I think that really chafes against our contemporary wiring, doesn't it?
Oh yes, it definitely does. And there's all these influences all around us. We want efficiency, and so there's this tension because the system is being constructed, or has been for the last 100 years, is built towards rule by experts, rule by those who know better, and so that's where these checks and balances, separation of power allows people who aren't the experts to have a word, to speak into it. And it slows things down. And we're in our society that values efficiency, we get frustrated by that, right? Why isn't Congress doing anything? And then the question is, why do they need to do anything? Like, what do you want? Like, justify their need? But our system is so kind of moving against our system is this. In part of it is this rule by experts, rule by the learned, it's a new aristocracy of we call it bureaucracy now, but it's really a new aristocracy. And so that's one of the, and that, again, that's a retrograde view, right? It's like, hell, we need to find people who are smarter than us to make decisions on our behalf. And let's build a system around that. And that's why there's all this frustration with um, separation of powers and those types of things, and staggered terms and all this stuff that people get frustrated with that. But it's built in to allow people to come together, to deliberate, and to disagree. Disagreement is built into our system. And so I hear people on all sides of the spectrum saying, oh, there's so much arguing and quarreling, and that's a good thing. That means our system is working if people are allowed to argue. If parents are allowed to show up at the school board and vociferously object to the way they're handling situations in their school district, that means the system is working, and that should extend all the way through Congress and the presidency. And so presidents on either party who don't have press conferences, don't like to be questioned, or issuing executive orders all the time, extending their executive power, and it's happened in both parties. This runs against the grain of a system that's deliberative. We argue about it, we talk about it, we come to a decision, and we move forward. And then you try again the next time. You try to get a hearing. The direct election of senators, which happened in the early 1900s, it was first introduced in the 1820s. It took 70 years for the direct election of senators to move through the amendment process. It took a long time. So there was a lot of deliberation on that before it actually became part of the Constitution. Some people say, well, that's way too long. But I would say, based on what? Like, what's too long? Until enough people are convinced in a democratic society to take a step forward, then you take the step forward. Then, if it took 100 years, unless people are convinced that it's a good way to go, then you don't take it. But the other view is, well, the experts say we should do it. Well, who are the experts? Why do they have any moral authority more than the common citizen? And that's, our system is fundamentally that. The common citizen and the expert are on the same plane.
Yeah.
For
And
sure.
I came across that notion in the study I've been doing for these shows and interviews and stuff, and thinking with you, the notion that the common man has voice, which is really unparalleled in human history, that the common man has the same ability to speak into something as well, theoretically anyway, as the president. And it's always been, I've always wondered, is it because I was the son of hippie parents or what? But I've never stood in awe of anyone.
Right.
And maybe that's a character flaw of my own. Maybe that's hubris or pride or self blindedness or something. I'm just not in awe of anybody. I don't fawn and preen over anybody. But maybe the founders were building that in to the very network of how we do things together.
They were, again, like, going back to first principles, like, because of the Imago Dei, we are all equal. I don't stand in awe of any, we as Americans, you shouldn't stand in awe of any monarch or any elitist, right? That's built into our system, our political system, for sure, but it's also built into the first principles of human equality. That if it means anything, it means um, that, no, as Jefferson put it, no one is born with saddles on their backs and others booted with spurs and ready to ride, right? That is, we don't have titles of nobility, right? No one by birth has a right to dictate to us, and that can be messy, right? And sometimes the common man can be unreasonable, but they have a chance to have their say. And but while the common man can be unreasonable, so can experts and bureaucrats. They can be very unreasonable, and when they're challenged, when their power isn't able to be challenged, then that's when it becomes tyranny. And the founders knew that, and they built a system to resist that.
Right. And earlier you mentioned that phrase, democracy on speed. And
Yeah.
it makes me think of a kind of cry or refrain I've been hearing, oh, maybe the last 16, 20 years, that it's time to get rid of the Electoral College. The Electoral
Yeah.
College is unfair. It lets the
Right.
little states have too much say. It's not a straight, we should just, everybody's vote should count equally. And the best way to make sure everybody's vote counts equally is to get rid of this crazy, ancient, morbid Electoral College. How do we process that?
Well, those who just want to go to a national popular vote is basically calling for rule by the urban centers of America. Los Angeles, basically what they're saying in code is Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, and Boston, they basically should rule the country, and all the unwashed people in the flyover states and in the parts of California and Oregon and Washington, whatever, that don't have voice. So people outside of Seattle, outside of Portland, outside of Los Angeles and San Francisco, um, all those people should just shut up and let us rule. That's what national popular vote is. And the electoral college was meant to spread the public voice. And if you like democracy, the electoral college, another way to think of it is you have 50 democratic votes. You have 50 elections. You have it in 50 states. So instead of one national election, you have 50 elections. And you take the results of those 50 elections, and they become, then you tally the electoral votes to see who won the most votes. And it's a combination of population, so size does matter. The big states have an outsized influence, but the small states collectively also have a voice. And so again, it's a very moderate proposal, and especially the way it has evolved over the years. So you have a balance of, yes, California has a lot of say in things, but it can be outmaneuvered, outvoted by a bunch of smaller states. Who's going to argue with that? This call for a national popular vote, essentially, like I said, is let's have the urban elites run the country and have the rest of the people just shut up. That's basically what it's saying. I don't think people necessarily know that. I haven't thought it through, but that's exactly what it would be.
Well, I think that I agree with you. I think that's exactly what's going on. And again, I go back to the genius of the founders, or how the Electoral College was eventually unpacked and set up. The notion of diversity is so esteemed today, and I can't think of a better way to affirm and protect the diversity of 50 states than the Electoral College. It would just be New York and Illinois and California, perhaps Texas, running the entire country, but instead we get 50 states who have some say by virtue of the Electoral College.
Yes, exactly. And it does. The word diversity is a good one. So I use that with my students when we teach about this. Like, do you want a more diverse system? Do you want where voices from all different parts of the country have a say? Or do you want a system that speaks in a mono voice of the urban elites in metropolitan centers? Because that's what we're talking about. And what do you think politics is going to be like when large swaths of the country are not allowed to have a voice in who their leadership is, right? That is not a recipe for peace and harmony. Look at the electoral college map. Look at the look. There's a great. You just Google on look at electoral college. There's great websites that show you electoral college maps. Large parts of the country don't vote for the winner, or do vote for the winner, but they don't vote. If you just went with those coastal elites, most of the country in terms of land area would not be represented. That is not healthy, right? The other thing the electoral college does that often gets overlooked, and this might sound hollow given the last few elections, but generally in our history, it decides on the winner very quickly and easily, because it does exaggerate the popular vote, right? Because the winner take all. If you win California by one vote, you get all of their electoral college votes. Now there's arguments over whether that's good or bad, but on the good side of the ledger, it allows the winner to be declared very quickly, and that's from a political philosophy point of view, that's very good to have stability, to know who won the day after, which then gets into our electoral. Like, they keep wanting to extend the electoral college, the election season, and we can count votes until days after the election. We can count them a month before. That's not good for stability, as we've seen, because people feel disenfranchised and they feel like the system is rigged. But the electoral college is meant to find a winner, find it quickly, but have the diverse input of all the states. And it has worked well through our country's history. There's been a couple of instances here and there where there's controversy, but you're going to have controversy. I mean, politics is about arguing over the direction of our society. So there's controversies baked into the system there.
Yeah, it's like every year there's a big debate about the college playoff football system. Should we have 2 teams, 4? Should the polling be involved?
Right.
Should the local divisions have their own playoffs? And you know what? No matter what, there's going to be an argument. You could have 4 teams, then you're going to argue about who got stiffed at number 5. You can have 8 teams in a playoff, then you're going to be arguing about who got cheated at number 9. But I like that. Again, the founders were aware that politics is about argumentation. Let's be deliberate. Let's have some sobriety mixed into that, and let's make it so that it has to take time to play out and not have an immediate democracy on speed. Tremendous wisdom there.
Yeah, and again, it goes back to our first principles, right? Human beings, human nature is such that we're capable of reasoned deliberation. If we come together and are sober-minded, we can come to some good decisions. But we're also fallen, so you can have the mob get out of control really quickly, or you can have elites get out of control really quickly. So you need to have a system that kind of moderates those two tendencies. But all that's based on a proper assumption of human nature.
Good. I love it. Hey, let me ask you 2 quick questions with respect to the era we're finding ourselves in. Real fast, and this is not a fair question to ask in a fast manner, but do you think the Constitution is going to survive what is a massive federal overreach that we're watching right now?
I think that is being pushed to a breaking point. I tend to be hopeful. Hope is a Christian virtue, and that I think we've been pushed to the breaking point before in the Civil War. Hundreds of thousands of people died standing up for their constitutional principles. I believe that there's still a vast majority of Americans, even though they don't vote together all the time, that still believe in our system at a deep level. So I think it will survive. I think one party or the other will kind of push the system to a breaking point, and I have faith that the American people will like, wait a second, we're not ready to jump off that cliff. We're not ready to get rid of the Senate filibuster. We're not ready to expand the Supreme Court to 100 justices. We're not ready to like all these things that would essentially kind of do away with our constitutional structure. I think enough Americans are sober minded enough to retain our structure that we have in some form. But I share your worry that things are being pushed to their limits. And there's been forces for 100 years in our system that have been forcing it to its limits because they don't believe in the fundamental premises of our system.
Yeah, it's been fascinating just over the last 2 years to watch classical liberals stand up and speak against sort of the democracy on speed or the wokeism or the corruption of the school system, because thinkers as they are, they're still of the opinion, hey, we can't do that. We still have to have limits. We still have to have boundaries. So I'm we need to be hopeful like you are on that. Secondly, COVID has brought about the development, I've been calling it slotch across the last 2 years, by which I mean overreaching administrative policies that somehow the government thinks it has, or local leaders, state governors think they have powers that I don't believe they were granted, even though that gets really sticky in terms of the legal constructions. With COVID going on, is this from a 30,000-foot level as a constitutional expert? Is this virus being handled in a way that respects and adheres to the Constitution? Or do you think that we're watching massive governmental overreach here?
It leans more towards the latter. And, COVID is a prime example of political philosophy being brought down to the everyday level. Do you want rule by bureaucrats that are not elected, that dictate what restaurants you can go to, when you can go to them, and so forth? And our system, you see federalism, you see different states handle it differently. I'm here in California, and our governor keeps passing dictate after dictate without legislative consent, as far as I can tell. Right. So there's a total breakdown in separation of powers, and people are scrambling to like, how do you restore some kind of deliberation to this, right? He and so no, I think you are seeing this 100-year tendency of progressive to lean on educated experts to run our society in lieu of the people and in lieu of deliberative reason. And you can't get it, like, you can talk about it at that 30,000-foot level, but when people are telling you can't go eat at your restaurant, or your kid's going to have to get a vaccine that they don't feel has been tested, we used to be a live and let live society, but experts are now telling people that you have to do it this way or that way. And I'm not taking a position on vaccines. I'm not going to take a position on any of this stuff. But in terms of how it's being governed, you see that tension. Do you want to defer to experts, or do you want the people to have a voice? And people are going to disagree. It is messier. It's much more efficient to have the public health czar dictate everybody gets the vaccine or not. It's messier to let people decide for themselves.
Right. And at one level, because I appreciate people who are studied and who are trained and who are skilled, at one level, I value having experts. The part that has been blowing my mind is most of these governors that run our 50 states are not medical doctors, and I know for certain not one of them is an epidemiologist. So
Right.
they're not experts, but they're making rulings like somehow they've just graduated with an 8-year medical degree or something. It's just completely fascinating to me.
Well, and that's the thing. It's not allowing the deliberation. It's not allowing other doctors who have a different opinion to marshal their evidence, right? I, like you, I love experts. I love the products of people who have a lot of knowledge in certain areas. It makes our lives better. But that's different than saying they can make prudential judgments about how to run our society. Just because someone's a good doctor doesn't mean they can a governor should be taking in all these prudential judgments about the effects of such and such decision on businesses, on various factors, not just privileging one factor over the other. And so, yeah, you see this conflict between elite dominance versus public deliberation. And people who are making they ask reasonable questions. I have a good friend he's vaccinated and everything. He runs a business in LA, and he's saying, you guys aren't even deliberating about the effects of these rules on businesses. You haven't even gone through. You don't even know what you're trying to achieve. Like, at what point do we lift this limitation? Because you don't have a metric to judge whether you've met that goal or not. You're just dictating on who knows what.
Yeah. Wild stuff. As we keep saying, we said it last week, it's certainly not boring.
No, it's not boring.
It's not boring. Sure. One last question. If Madison showed up today, if he could see what's going on in the United States, what would he be happy about from what the founders did? And where do you think he'd be alarmed?
I think he would be very happy that we have a sprawling coast to coast commercial republic that is vital, that is the world's dominant economy, that still allows maximal human freedom, and is still largely a virtuous people that do the right thing most of the time. He would be alarmed at the encroachments on that beautiful thing that he and his cohort had created. He would be alarmed at the excessive kind of bureaucratic governance, the move away from public deliberation. He would be alarmed at the public dismissal of the importance of virtue, the importance of limits on human behavior, the importance. He'd be alarmed at the anarchy, the social anarchy that seems to be sown by kind of more modern variants of what human liberty should be. And he would, I think, rightly see the dangers of breaking down the institutions that have preserved this realm of liberty, and he'd be alarmed at the notions of liberty and equality that do threaten to break down the institutions that are preserving those things rightly understood. Those would be alarmed, but there'd be a lot. I think he would be amazed at the success of our country, and it's a coastal polity that's dynamic in so many ways. But he'd be alarmed that there are seeds threatening to undermine all that we've created here.
Well, Dr. Guerra, we know that you are a rare bird, a Christian, a trained political scientist who also thinks in light of a Christian worldview. And so it has been an utter joy to have you on the show, and I appreciate you helping us unpack some of these issues again, because I think there is such a gap, such a lacuna among societal thinking, let alone just Christian thinking. So it's been an absolute privilege to have you on the show.
I've really enjoyed it, Ed. Thanks for inviting me.
All right. Well, God bless, and the Lord bless your family and your health.
Thank you.
Well, wow. I hope you enjoyed that, just even a little bit of how much I did and how much I took away from that. You guys, thanks so much for being with me today. Please go now and turn your beautiful God-given brains on, everybody.